The chapel was still when they found her. Not silent, because silence implies a lack of sound, but still in that dreadful way a place becomes when all motion has stopped, but the echo of something sacred still lingers. The sun hadn't yet crested the woods, and the stained glass windows of Wicklow Glen's oldest hilltop chapel glowed faintly with blue and dust-filtered light. 17-year-old Clara Felton lay at the base of the altar, arms crossed lightly, lips parted, skin pale and dry like something that had not been kissed by breath for hours. Her gown was pristine, fitted perfectly to her frame, no wrinkling, no soil. Only the cold beneath her that betrayed how long she'd been gone. Her hair had been combed flat against her temples. Her shoes had been cleaned with vinegar and cotton. Her eyes were closed as if someone had done it for her carefully. This was not collapse. This was not chaos, this was presentation. Above her, mounted in the oak frame behind the pulpit, hung the veiled portrait of her mother. Its presence had been ceremonial for every Felton daughter's wedding for over 40 years. An oil rendering of a woman in ivory lace, gloved hands, and a shadowed expression that time had eaten away. But that morning, beneath its dusty veil, something else was wrong. Clara's fiancé, Matthew Langdon, was the first to notice. His hands trembled when he pointed to her fingers. The ring, the one meant to seal the family covenant passed down through generations. It wasn't there. He said her hand had felt empty even before he touched it, as if the space itself was colder than the rest of her. The ring was missing. Again. She had been escorted to the chapel the night before, just before dusk, following the Felton family custom of pre-wedding retreat. No one outside the family was ever permitted to attend this part. A tradition, they said, to prepare the daughter for sanctity. The groom would wait until sunrise. The door would be opened. The bride would emerge. That was the way it had been for every Felton daughter. The way it had been when Clara's older cousin Mary Ann was found cold in her dressing room on the morning of her own wedding 11 years prior. The way it had been when her Aunt Ruth was discovered collapsed across the foot of her bridal bed in 1889. Each time the explanation was sudden illness. Each time the ring vanished with the breath. When the county physician arrived, he noted no bruising, no struggle, no outward wound. Her lungs, however, told a different story. Dry. Too dry. As if the moisture had been drawn out slowly over hours. Her tongue bore no bite marks. Her limbs weren't rigid. There were faint marks around her nostrils, almost invisible impressions like something small had been pressed over them, not hard, not violently, but persistently. No signs of fear in her face, no gasping, just stillness. Peace, if you could call it that. But the room told more than the body did. Near the altar, a small dish of lavender water had been placed, stale, unmoving. A sprig of crushed myrtle beside it. Atop the altar itself, beneath the flower arrangement, someone had left a folded lace handkerchief. Embroidered in its corner in faint red thread were the letters CF. The corner had been torn slightly, just enough to expose the inner lining, where something brittle and glass-like was tucked between the seams. A sliver no longer than a thumbnail, translucent and sharp. Not something that could be accidentally sewn in. The chapel was locked from the inside. Only Clara's mother, Margaret Felton, held the key. She had gone home shortly after dusk the night before, leaving Clara for her retreat, as was tradition. She arrived in the morning, dressed in mourning gray instead of celebratory white. When asked how she knew, she simply said, "I felt the light leave." Her words were not hysterical. They were measured as if rehearsed. She did not ask to see the body. She asked if the ring had been found. When told it hadn't, she sighed just once and asked the Reverend to uncover the portrait. The veil had always remained in place before, even during ceremonies. No one could recall seeing it removed. But that morning the fabric fell limp, revealing the face of Clara's mother from her own youth, pale, painted stiff but noticeably altered. The eyes were not painted at all. Only empty sockets, smooth skin where color should have been. A woman preserved without gaze. No one spoke for a while after that. The Reverend ordered the building cleared, the sheriff called. But no charges were filed. The body was claimed within the hour. The chapel was closed that afternoon, and inside the town's memory a weight returned, because Clara wasn't the first Felton daughter to die before saying vows, and she would not be the last. It was 2 days after the burial when the new Reverend Eli Thatcher finally returned to the chapel. The townspeople assumed he'd gone quiet from grief, but he wasn't grieving, he was listening. Listening to what the older pew ladies whispered about Clara's mother, about the Felton name, about the way no daughter ever seemed to leave that chapel with a ring on her finger and breath in her chest. There had been rumors before, of course, small-town gossip, things said between teeth. But Clara's death had stirred something colder, something more permanent. And it lived, Reverend Thatcher suspected, in the painting. It wasn't unusual for old families to commission bridal portraits. What made the Felton painting strange wasn't the tradition, but the enforcement of it. No one outside the Felton bloodline had ever been permitted to handle or clean the painting. Not even the Reverend's predecessor had touched it, though he'd served there for over 30 years. It hung from a single thick iron hook above the altar, shrouded in tulle lace, unveiled only for wedding mornings. Or funerals. Clara's was both. Reverend Thatcher waited until the chapel was empty. He locked the doors, unlatched the hook, and took the painting down himself. It was heavier than it looked, and dust clung to the corners like sediment in a grave. The oil had faded in the background over time, but the figure remained sharp. Margaret Felton is a young woman in white gloves, sitting in a high-backed chair with a single rose at her wrist. But it was the face that disturbed him. Not the expression, not the stillness, but the absence. The eyes weren't simply dulled by time. They had never been painted. Where the sockets should have held gaze, the canvas was bare. Pale primer stared back instead of color. No brushstroke, no shading, no outline. Just smooth flesh where identity should have lived. It looked intentional, and worse, it looked ritualistic. Thatcher turned the frame over, thinking maybe a dedication or artist's signature might explain something. Instead, he found an inscription scorched into the wood beneath the canvas backing. It was etched in careful hand, small and even, like the lettering of a school teacher. He traced each groove with his finger as he read. 13 names, all female, all with the same surname: Annabelle Felton, Ruth Felton, Eliza Felton, Marianne Felton, Clara Felton. He counted them again. 13 names, 13 daughters, 13 dates, each one within a week of a scheduled wedding, each one marked unfulfilled. There was no artist's signature, no blessing, no date of painting. Just a line beneath the list carved deeper than the rest, reading, "Purity is not worn, it is proven." The Reverend staggered backward. It wasn't grief he felt, it was recognition. A cold clarity that this painting wasn't meant to commemorate. It was meant to catalog, not the lives of the Felton daughters, but the failures. The ones who didn't finish the ritual, the ones who didn't make it to the altar. It wasn't a portrait of Margaret Felton. It was a ledger of sacrifice. And those eyeless sockets weren't unfinished, they were mirrors. A way to force whoever stood beneath it to imagine their own eyes instead. Their own reflection in a body prepared for something it never reached. Reverend Thatcher didn't sleep that night. He kept the chapel locked. He told no one what he'd found. But the next morning, he went quietly to the county archives. He asked for the death records on every woman listed. Not a single one mentioned cause of death beyond vague terms: nervous exhaustion, sudden malaise, emotional arrest. And not a single investigation had ever been opened. No suspicions noted, no autopsies preserved. He left the archives with a name he hadn't seen before: Evangeline Felton, the matriarch, the one who began the lineage, the first to enforce the rites. Her name wasn't on the canvas, but her shadow was in every name that followed. And Reverend Thatcher knew, without needing the proof yet, that the ritual wasn't about death. It was about obedience, about keeping something alive that should have been buried long ago. Something that still watched from the chapel walls, even without eyes. He came quietly, the way people do when they feel shame without knowing why. Matthew Langdon, barely 19 and still wearing the same jacket he'd worn the morning Clara was found, walked up the church steps 3 days after the funeral and asked for Reverend Thatcher by name. His hands stayed in his coat pockets the entire time. His eyes were red not from crying but from holding something back. He didn't ask if he could sit. He simply stood there in the back pew and said, "I need to tell you something about the night before." Thatcher listened, not as a man of God, but as a man who understood what it meant to carry weight when no one else believed it existed. Matthew spoke slowly, careful not to stumble. He said Clara had asked him once, just once, if he believed people could choose not to wake up, not from sadness, not from despair, but from fear. She hadn't said what she was afraid of, only that it was something all Felton women went through, something the men weren't meant to see. She called it the cleanse, Matthew said, his voice shaking on the word. Said every Felton girl did it the night before, alone, in the chapel. Her mother gave her something to drink, something bitter. Said it was supposed to soften the voice, whatever that means. Clara said it always started with the throat. Thatcher asked if Clara had seemed ill that day. Matthew shook his head. She seemed like she was trying to memorize the air, he said. Like she wasn't sure she'd get to breathe it again. He went on. Clara hadn't wanted a big wedding. No music, no town invitations, just the family, the reverend, and a quiet walk down the aisle. But her mother insisted the old rites be honored. The lace gloves, the silence vow, the solitary night in the chapel. It was always this way, Margaret had said. To go from daughter to wife, you had to shed the voice of the child. The night before the ceremony, Clara had squeezed his hand and told him not to wait long if she was late in the morning. She said it with a smile, but not the kind that meant peace. It was the kind that masks a thing you know you can't stop. Matthew hadn't slept that night. He paced his father's barn, then walked the fields until dawn. When the chapel door finally opened and the light didn't spill out like it should, he ran inside before anyone could stop him. She was there beneath the portrait, perfect, lifeless, her ring finger bare, and in that moment, he said, something inside him cracked, not from grief, but from realization. She knew, he whispered. She knew what that night meant. He asked Thatcher a question then, one he hadn't spoken aloud before. He asked if a ritual passed down long enough, carried gently and spoken softly, could still be murder. Thatcher didn't answer, but Matthew already knew. He left the chapel without another word. He didn't ask for comfort, he didn't ask for the truth, he only left a folded piece of paper behind. A note Clara had written to him the week prior, sealed in wax, never opened. It contained no vows, no promises, only one line, written in small, even script. If I don't wake up in time to wear the dress, remember, I loved you before they tried to make me clean. Thatcher held that letter in his hand long after Matthew had gone. And in that small confession, so gently worded it almost passed for poetry, he saw the same pattern. the same cold logic. These girls hadn't been dying from panic or nerves, they'd been preparing for a silence so old it was mistaken for obedience. And whatever had been taken from them, it wasn't just their lives, it was their voice, their vows. The right to say no before the lace was fastened, before the ring was slipped on, before the breath left quietly in the night. They said it was apoplexy, as if a girl of 19 could simply drop to the floor from the weight of her own nerves. As if breath could leave a body that young without struggle. As if something unseen, not planned, not delivered, not waited for, could just stop a heart that had never known failure. But those were the words written in the register for Annabel Felton in the summer of 1861. Sudden, unpreventable, entirely natural. But none of it felt natural even then. Annabel was the first Felton daughter meant to marry under the new house right. The war had just begun to scratch at the country's throat, and while other households worried about soldiers and borders, the Feltons in Wicklow Glen turned inward. They spoke of sanctity, of preserving family name, of quiet obedience to domestic order. And in the center of it all was Evangeline Felton, mother, widow, and by then already something colder than either. The wedding was to take place in August beneath the summer sycamores outside the chapel. The invitations had been written in Evangeline's own hand. No music, no meat, just ceremony. Annabel had been seen that morning by the servants, pale and thinner than usual, pressing her fingertips into the window glass of her upstairs room. She hadn't spoken much for weeks, they said. Only listened. Listened to her mother's voice reading from the white book. The book itself had no title on the spine, just an embroidered cover of pressed ivory linen, and inside an index of virtues written in the same hand across all pages. Cleanliness, obedience, quietness of mind, chastity of expression, hospitality of the flesh. Each virtue was followed by a ritual, some simple daily fasting, brushing of the tongue with salt, stitching of hymns onto fabric without speech. Others were stranger, submersion without movement. Recitation with breath held, stillness tests measured by melted wax rings. The last time anyone saw Annabel alive, she was walking with her mother toward the closed parlor room, the one beneath the western eaves where no servants were permitted. Evangeline carried the white book. Annabel walked without shoes. Her gown was buttoned all the way to the neck, her fingers wrapped in muslin strips. A faint red bloom had appeared behind one of the wrappings, as if something beneath had split open from pressure. They remained in that room for hours. No voices were heard, no movement. When Evangeline emerged, her hands were clean. Her face unreadable. She told the housekeeper to fetch the physician. When he arrived, she explained that Annabel had collapsed mid-prayer, that she had fallen to her knees and never stood again, that she had not suffered. But the physician noted something odd. No spasm, no post-mortem stiffness, no signs of stroke or fever, only the absence of life, and the distinct scent of vinegar and crushed glass on the girl's lips. Still, he wrote what he was told. Apoplexy. He did not press further. Evangeline gave him 2 envelopes that day, one containing payment, the other a request for silence. Annabel was buried in the family plot, but no marker was placed. Instead, Evangeline had a stone bench carved for the garden, etched with a line from the white book. A vessel must be clean to carry legacy. The gown Annabel had worn was never burned, never boxed. It was folded, pressed, and hung in a cedar closet on the 3rd floor. The next daughter would wear it. In the weeks after, servants reported the parlor room had changed. The scent of ash lingered longer. The fireplace, though unused, felt warm. And once, beneath the floorboards, a housemaid heard a soft chime, not like a bell, but like glass breaking underwater. No one ever spoke Annabel's name again. But within the white book a new virtue had been added. The ink was fresh, the script familiar. Sacrifice, to yield the self without scream or stain. And in the margin, in a red pencil barely visible, 3 small letters appeared. AF. It was the beginning of something that would stretch decades. A ritual misnamed as virtue. A legacy painted in lace and silence. And it began with the first bride who never returned. The northeast wing of the Felton estate had always been colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. The windows there were taller, facing nothing but the tree line, and the floorboards had a deeper creak, as if groaning with something no one wanted spoken aloud. Servants were told to avoid it without reason. Children were not allowed to play near it. And after Ruth Felton died in the same quiet, breathless manner as her cousin Annabel, the door was sealed entirely, under the claim that sorrow should be contained out of respect. But respect was never the reason. It was Ruth's death in 1873 that forced the first real whispers. She had been healthy, joyful even. 17, newly engaged, and heard singing a hymn by herself just hours before the ritual began. She had gone willingly into the room, her mother locking the door behind her with the same key that Evangeline Felton had once used. A retreat. A spiritual fast. That's what they called it when girls entered that wing and didn't come back out. The room itself sat at the end of a narrow corridor behind a faded green door with no visible knob, only a sliding bolt placed high where no child could reach. After Ruth's death, the coroner came from a neighboring county, outside the Feltons' influence. He insisted on seeing the room despite protest. What he found was not grief, it was design. The wallpaper had been torn in strips. Beneath it, the plaster was covered in faint script, familiar phrases twisted backward, domine, non sum dignus. But in reverse, whole passages from Psalms bent into a private language. There were markings in the corners too, circles with slashes, symbols that did not match any religious order but repeated like code. One wall had the appearance of a chalkboard wiped too quickly, as if something had been written and erased 100 times, never fully disappearing. But it was the wooden paneling near the cot that disturbed him most. Dozens of shallow grooves, tight and erratic, dug into the wood with something sharp but unsteady. He ran a gloved hand across them and found curled splinters and traces of blood turned brown with age. Each groove was no longer than a fingernail, and they were layered, some deep, others faint, like someone had tried to claw through the wall inch by inch, not in one moment of panic but over hours. The bedding was pristine, folded, pressed, formal, as if nothing had happened. The window was latched. The hearth had been used, though no fire was lit when he arrived. And the air smelled wrong, sweet but spoiled. Like formaldehyde left near something living, in the fireplace beneath a thin layer of ash, he found what looked like the base of a candle. But it wasn't wax. It was something thicker. Hardened animal fat wrapped around a thin bone wick, not ritual in appearance, ritual in intent. There was a small stool in the corner with a basin beneath it. When lifted, the coroner recoiled. A puddle of something milky, faintly red, sat untouched as if waiting for a second act. The Felton women claimed it was part of a purification rite, meant to purge sickness of the womb, a tradition from older times. But when the coroner took a sample, he found particles not consistent with anything natural. Fragments of crushed glass. Traces of salt. Something that, if ingested, could rupture the soft tissue of the throat in minutes. Still, his report was overruled. The Feltons had the county's oldest name. The certificate listed nervous collapse. The room was sealed again the next morning, and the key returned to Margaret Felton, Evangeline's daughter and Ruth's sister. No one entered that wing again for decades. But servants reported things. A humming sound through the walls, the scent of roses that didn't match the season. And once during a thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning struck a tree beside the estate, and a pane from the northeast window shattered outward, not inward. They found no bird, no stone, no object, just glass blown outward like something had exhaled. The room was never repainted, never plastered over, not even the scripture was scrubbed clean. It was left as it was, like a warning or a monument or a place still waiting for someone else to finish what had been started. And in the margins of the white book, another line appeared beside the word sacrifice. A new hand had written it, one firmer, bolder. If the body breaks, the soul may be spared. Another rule, another death, another daughter sealed behind a door built not to keep evil out, but to hold it in. The journal was bound in soft brown leather, its pages brittle at the edges, each corner worn from use but kept in deliberate condition. It was found in the bottom drawer of a locked cedar chest. Beneath a folded bridal veil, a pair of child-sized gloves and a cracked hand mirror wrapped in linen. The script inside was elegant and sharp, each line pressed with care, the ink dark enough to suggest it had not faded despite the passage of decades. The cover bore no title, but the first page did. In fine cursive it read, "Doctrine for the Preparation and Refinement of Daughters in Matrimonial Transition." Below it a date, October 6th, 1874, and a signature, Evangeline Felton. She had written it not as a mother, but as a founder, a woman who had taken the pain of losing her daughter Annabelle and twisted it into purpose. From that wound she carved a system. What followed was not grief, but a guide. In her own words, the goal was simple: to render the female vessel clean, not only in body but in thought, breath, and memory, before union may be sanctified. She called it the Clean Girl Doctrine, and from its opening page it was clear that this was not superstition. It was instruction. Each section was structured like scripture, numbered and titled, as though it were a sacred text. Section 1. Withdrawal of external noise, instructed that the daughter be placed in isolation for a minimum of 12 hours prior to the rite, with no visual stimulation, no mirrors, no fabric with dye, and no human voice except the mother's. The goal, Evangeline wrote, was to quiet the unclean echoes of the world so that the soul may face itself. Section 2. Cleansing of breath and blood, detailed the ingestion of purifying tonics, a bitter liquid made of salt water, powdered bark, and diluted ash, said to dull the tongue and strip false hungers. If the girl resisted, it was to be administered by cloth while she slept. The throat must be softened. The mouth must forget how to speak on its own. Section 3. Starvation of the world's voice, called for a fast, not just of food but of memory. The bride was to recite no name, think of no childhood, utter no request. Instead, she was to lie still in white cotton, hands gloved, eyes covered, and mouth bound gently with silk during sleep. It was described as symbolic restraint, but Evangeline emphasized that a body that cannot speak cannot sin. The journal included pages for tracking compliance, names, dates, results. Annabelle's was the first. Stage 2 incomplete, it read. Resistance evident. Ruth followed. Progress acceptable, shortness of breath noted, no struggle. Each daughter was a case study, each failure became a refinement of the next protocol. Over time, new stages were added: submersion without panic, heat without cry, stillness during pain. The most disturbing entry was handwritten on an unnumbered page near the back. No title, just a paragraph scrawled hastily as if added in a moment of divine realization. If the flesh suffers without rupture, the soul is made clean. If the mind drifts without anchor, the past cannot rot the future. If she goes quiet on her own, she has been made ready. These were not rituals for sanctity. They were rehearsals for surrender, not of love, not of fear, but of identity. Servants who later read the journal in secret claimed to recognize certain phrases from their time in the house. Commands whispered during preparations, instructions passed off as old family ways. One recalled being asked to heat a porcelain basin of milk until it curdled, then told to place it beneath a bride's bed while she slept. Another remembered folding gloves around stones, then sliding them over the girl's hands without explanation. None of them knew why. Not until they read Evangeline's doctrine. It was never about readiness, never about virtue. It was about removal of will, of voice, of memory, until only the shape of a daughter remained. And beneath the final entry, in faint red ink barely legible beneath a water stain, one final sentence had been added in Evangeline's own hand. Clean girls don't speak. They are spoken through. What she built wasn't just a house. It was a doctrine that devoured generation after generation and left behind daughters too clean to scream. It was the sound of water that led them there, water where there shouldn't have been any. Years after the estate had fallen quiet and Margaret Felton had passed under her own shroud of secrecy, the house was sold off room by room to private collectors and historians. But it was a local archivist named Lyle Brenner who asked the question no one else had. What was beneath the root cellar? The blueprints said nothing. No foundation, no crawl space. But the drain in the middle of the cellar floor, capped with iron, unmovable, suggested otherwise. And when the boards were finally lifted and the stone beneath pried loose, the opening was revealed. Not a stairwell, but a square vertical shaft, large enough for a person, cut into the earth with smooth precision. The ladder bolted to the wall was old, its rungs rusted to orange and black. The air that rose from below was dry, too dry. No scent of mold or damp, only something faintly metallic and sterile, like a room never meant for weather. Brenner descended slowly, one step at a time, until the chamber unfolded beneath him. The walls were white marble, veined with gray but dulled with time. Each panel fit perfectly to the next, as if sealed to keep something in, not out. The floor was padded not with fabric but with a dense rubberized lining cracking in the corners. At the center a drain, not a sinkhole, not a grating. A single circular opening the size of a hand, ringed with tarnished brass and sloped slightly outward as if to collect something spilled often. To the left, a door, metal, heavy, no handle on the inside. Just a single locking mechanism mounted on the exterior frame. Above it, a small hatch, a voice pipe. It led straight upward, its end unseen, but when Brenner called into it, his voice echoed and shifted, hollowed by the shape of something chambered. It was later confirmed that the pipe connected directly to the floor beneath the altar of the chapel. Whatever was said in that room above had traveled downward. And more disturbingly, whatever sounds emerged from this chamber had once drifted up into a place of worship, muffled beneath the pulpit's feet. In the far corner, half buried in the dust, lay the object that ended any doubt. A long glass-blowing pipe rusted at the stem, its mouthpiece split with a dark red stain where the tip met the floor. Not fresh, not recent, but unmistakable. Near it sat a folded cloth, stiff with age, soaked through long ago. The pipe wasn't used for art. Its size was wrong. Its stem was too narrow, its tip too jagged. It had been designed not to create, but to force. Later analysis revealed particles of powdered glass embedded in the cloth, enough to coat a throat if inhaled, enough to shred the soft tissues without leaving external bruises, enough to still a voice forever from the inside. On the wall above the pipe, etched faintly into the marble, were 5 small symbols. Circles with crosses arranged in a curve like a closed mouth. Beneath them, scratched deeper, a single line in Latin, Vocem tollis animam salvus. remove the voice, save the soul. There were no windows, no light, no way to tell time once inside, and the door, thick and without interior release, confirmed what the doctrine had only implied. This chamber was not for reflection. It was for surrender, a place where daughters were placed to be stilled, not cleansed, not comforted, stilled. Brenner reported everything, but no prosecution followed. The statute of limitations had long since passed, and the Feltons were ghosts on paper. The estate was deemed historically significant and quietly passed into the hands of a private preservation trust. The chamber was sealed again, marked as unstable, but those who visited in the months before it closed said they felt something when they stepped near the voice pipe, an urge to speak, to call out even if they didn't know what for. And the strange part was, when they did, something hollow always answered. A faint exhale, or the memory of one. The report was folded 5 times and tucked inside the hollow of an old ledger book, where it had remained untouched for nearly 4 decades. It surfaced by accident, found between rotting pages of land records donated to the county archives. The paper had yellowed, the ink gone brittle, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate, and unmistakably real. At the top, Private Observations, Dr. Thomas Bellamy, March 4, 1891. The name of the deceased had been redacted in smudged pencil, but the initials remained. SF, another Felton daughter, another death that never saw light. The physician had been summoned at night. He wrote that the call came not from the family, but from a Felton servant in distress. The girl, 16, perhaps 17, had reportedly fainted during her preparation retreat. He arrived within the hour, met at the chapel by Margaret Felton, and a stench he couldn't quite place. It smelled of lime and burnt cloth, he wrote, but beneath it lingered something else, something dry as if the air had passed through ash before reaching the lungs. He described the girl's condition clinically at first, pale, thin, unconscious, but with shallow breath. No bruising, no broken bones. Her dress had been removed and replaced with a stiff white sheet, knotted tight at the ankles and throat. Her mouth was closed, but her lips were cracked and ringed with red-gray dust. Her breathing grew weaker as he examined her, and when she finally exhaled for the last time, he noted the faint sound of something brittle, like powder shifting in glass. The autopsy, performed in secrecy the following morning, was short and silent. He was paid in advance to forego official paperwork. But he kept his notes anyway. He opened the chest cavity and found the lungs mottled with lesions, not wet like pneumonia, not stiff like cancer, but hollowed in parts, as if something sharp had torn through them from the inside. Microscopic examination revealed fragments, thin, translucent shards barely visible without angled light, not bone, not stone, something finer, softer. Glass. He traced the damage from throat to lung, a path of internal scarring, small ruptures, and crystallized tissue. The girl had inhaled something, not by accident, but by ritual. I have seen the effects of powdered quartz in factory girls, he wrote. I have seen ash lungs and coal-black coughs, but this was finer than dust, sharper than sand, a deliberate foreign body. He continued, the pattern is consistent with forced inhalation. The particles had cut the airways over hours, not seconds. This was no fever. This was a process. He confronted the family. Margaret Felton refused comment. A man, unnamed in the report, delivered a second envelope with an additional payment and a note instructing Dr. Bellamy to list the cause of death as scarlet consumption, a now archaic term that blended tuberculosis with romantic euphemism. Something tragic, yet common. Something that wouldn't raise alarms. He obeyed, but not without protest. In his private letter, tucked beneath the report never mailed, he addressed his wife, confessing he had treated many families, but none who guarded their daughter's death so tightly. "There is something in that house," he wrote, "that eats the voice and leaves only breathless obedience in its place. And now it has taken her lungs too." He left medicine a year later, moved south, never spoke of the case again. But the report survived, sealed and hidden inside a false ledger, as if even he knew one day the truth would need to be remembered. Historians confirm the initials SF matched Susanna Felton, a daughter listed in no public record of marriage or death, only a brief mention in the family's garden registry. Susanna's rose bush removed 1891. No grave, no obituary, just a plant taken up from soil and a girl who died of dust before she could wear the gown. And on the final page of Bellamy's report, 3 words had been underlined twice. This was ritual, not illness, not misfortune, but sacrifice, cut into the lungs one breath at a time. Evangeline Felton never remarried. Her husband, Tobias Felton, had died in the winter of 1860, weeks before their daughter Annabelle's betrothal, and months before the first unexplained death turned ritual. The records say he slipped on ice near the estate stables. His skull split cleanly at the temple. But the servants whispered otherwise. They said he had argued with Evangeline the night before, that his boots were found too far from the path, that he'd told a cousin in Boston he was worried about what's being done to the girls. Regardless, after his death, Evangeline went silent. Not grieving, not broken, focused. She refused to wear mourning black. In fact, she never again dressed in color. From that year forward, she was seen only in white. Gowns she altered herself, stitched late into the night, pale fabrics she washed in lavender water and dried in the same sunroom where her daughters once played. She claimed it was to keep the house's energy clean. But nothing in the house ever felt clean again. By the time the 3rd daughter died in 1883, neighbors had stopped asking questions. The Feltons held too much land, too many secrets, and Evangeline had turned cold as stone. She began to appear in public only for chapel services and premarital ceremonies. Each time she wore white gloves, a matching shawl, and a gown that was never quite the same, but always familiar. It was Margaret, her eldest living daughter, who eventually told a visiting cousin that Evangeline had kept every gown worn by her lost daughters. Not in trunks, not in storage, but on mannequins in a locked attic room, brushed, preserved, and altered to fit her own aging frame. She would rotate through them as if they were seasonal robes. One for fasting months, one for rituals, one for speaking to the reverend, and always one kept folded in linen, pressed flat, only brought out the night before a daughter was meant to marry. She began overseeing the cleansing rites herself after Annabelle's death, removing even the midwives from the process. What had once been passed down orally became formalized, scripted, recorded in her hand and stored in the doctrine journal now stained with decades of careful cruelty. She instructed Margaret, then Ruth, then Susanna, each girl younger than the last, each subjected to a longer list of preparation steps. And always Evangeline would stand outside the chamber door, gloved hand resting on the latch, whispering the same phrase through the keyhole. One must be worthy of the name. The housekeeper at the time, a woman named Noreen Alcott, later confessed in private to a neighbor that she once saw Evangeline outside that door after midnight, her head tilted against the wood, lips moving silently. She wasn't praying, Noreen said. She was mouthing instructions, timing something with her gloved fingers, holding her breath. She would lift one finger at a time slowly, then start again. The housekeeper never returned after that night. By 1895, the Felton house had become a place of ritual, not residence. Meals were silent. Windows were kept closed during wind. Brides-to-be were forbidden from singing, even humming, during their engagement months. If a girl smiled too wide, Evangeline would gently touch her wrist and say, "Dignity is silent joy." She died in her sleep at age 67 in the same room where Annabelle's portrait hung. Her cause of death was listed as natural, but the expression on her face was anything but peaceful. The undertaker noted her hands were clenched into fists and her jaw stiff with tension. They had to pry it open to place the death beads inside. She was buried in white, not in a widow's gown, not in a matron's lace, but in the altered wedding dress last worn by Susanna. It still held faint rust at the neckline, still bore the broken stitching from the chamber floor, still smelled of lavender and something fainter, metallic, nearly gone. The women of Wicklow Glen say that when she died, the air in the chapel lightened for a season. But only for a season. Because what Evangeline had built wasn't just a doctrine. It was a legacy that outlived her breath. A system that spoke louder in silence than it ever had in voice. And the gowns she left behind still hung pressed and waiting, each one folded like a question no one dared to ask. It began as a gift. Evangeline Felton had sewn the wedding gown herself at age 17, the year she was promised to Tobias. She spoke of it often, not in warmth, but in reverence. She claimed the pattern had come to her in a dream. The lace was imported, the silk bodice stitched with bone thread harvested from dove wings, or so she claimed. Every inch of the garment had meaning. The sleeves were long to hide scars, the hem high enough to keep from dragging sin, the veil stitched with symbols only she understood. When she married, the dress was barely visible beneath her heavy coat. It rained that day, and the carriage took her straight to the chapel doors. It was never worn again, not by her. But she did not bury it, nor store it away. She preserved it. Over the years, the gown was brought out only for daughters, not for their fittings, but for their final rites. As each girl approached her wedding, the dress was carefully removed from its cedar casing and hung above the marble basin room in the northeast wing, its skirt suspended from wire hooks so that the fabric never touched the floor. A sacred relic, Evangeline called it, a vessel. She insisted the earth itself was unworthy to graze it. No alterations were ever made, not when the girls' shoulders were broader or their frames thinner. The dress would mold to them, Evangeline said, once the voice was stilled, once the spirit quieted enough to fit. After Annabelle's death, it was Ruth who next wore it, but only after the cleansing. The servants were not permitted to assist. Margaret, who had not yet been married herself, watched as her mother folded the gown along a marble slab, whispering scripture that didn't match any known psalm. Ruth's body was dressed after death, its posture arranged to mirror Evangeline's portrait, arms across the chest, hands gloved, mouth sealed with wax. The dress flowed over her like water that had been waiting too long to move. And then again, with Susanna, then Elizabeth, then Clara. Each time the same care, the same linen gloves, the same refusal to launder or cut or mend. Small bloodstains were merely pressed with lavender water and hidden beneath lace. Seams that tore were hand-stitched with threads harvested from the inside hem. No thread from outside the house was ever allowed to touch the gown again. It was a womb of its own design, passed down with the same purpose every time, to carry something sacred into stillness. No girl ever wore the dress and lived past her wedding eve. And still, it was preserved, always folded, always elevated. The gown never touched earth. It was hung on brass hooks inside the attic chapel, suspended over a mirrored floor that reflected it like an open grave. In her final years, Margaret took over its care. After Evangeline's death, she spoke less of cleanliness and more of continuity. She believed the dress held not just memory, but compliance. that each daughter who wore it absorbed the weight of the last, and by doing so erased her own unrest. "The stiller you lie, the better it fits," she once told a cousin visiting from Concord. The cousin never returned. When Clara died, the gown was once again brought out. By then, the bodice was stiff with time. The veil yellowed at the edges, the sleeves bore wear from too many wrists pulled tight in ceremony. But it was still used. It was still clean by their standards. Margaret dressed her without help. No one saw the process, but the undertaker noted that the gown had been damp when he arrived. Not from sweat, not from rain, but from blood, dried at the seams, pressed into the inner lining. A bloom near the throat shaped like a small handprint. It was the first time the dress had been folded with visible stain left unmasked. And when it was returned to the cedar chest, the scent of lavender could no longer cover the metallic undertone beneath it. The hooks that held it bent slightly that year, as if the weight had finally shifted. No one wore the gown again after Clara, but no one destroyed it either. It remains sealed, untouched, in a private archive labeled only as Artifact A, Ritual Textile. They say it hums when disturbed. They say it creaks without breeze, and still it has never touched the floor. Not even once. Because for the Feltons, the dress was not meant for walking. It was meant for lowering gently, precisely over daughters who had gone still in silence. Daughters who had made themselves small enough to fit. The attic had long been considered the quietest room in the Felton house. Not for its silence, but for the way sound seemed to vanish once you stepped through its door. It was narrow, long, paneled with pale wood that had warped with heat and filled with dust that floated thick even when the windows were closed. Most believed it held only trunks, boxes of aging linen, disused hymnals, and the brittle relics of a once prestigious family. But after the estate's partial conversion into a historical archive in the late 1950s, an archivist cataloging old legal texts came across something that hadn't been recorded on any floor plan. Behind a false wall of plaster and lath, neatly stacked in 4 rows, sat dozens of books. None had titles. None had covers, just faded bindings with no print and no protective spines, bare stitchwork exposed like muscle under torn skin. Some were wrapped in string. Others had lace ribbon binding them shut. But all were hollowed. Inside each was a series of folded pages, handwritten, stained at the edges with oil and age, and stitched down the center like a body being gently sealed. The ink varied, but the handwriting bore a pattern, tight, deliberate, feminine. At first glance, the contents resembled journal entries, but upon closer reading, each page began the same way. "To whom I am promised." And what followed was not diary, not prayer, but something more haunting. They were vows, wedding vows, but not the kind spoken aloud. They held no declarations of joy, no poetic lines about love or future or shared life. These were private contracts, each one written in the days or hours before a daughter entered her final preparation. "If I am made ready, I will carry the name without tremble. If my silence is accepted, I ask no voice in return. If I sleep too deeply to wake, let my stillness be proof of grace." The pages were brittle from folding. Creases ran through each sentence as if the girls had written them on their knees in secret, folding them in half after each line, as though not even they wanted to read their own words in full. One vow belonging to E.F., Eleanor Felton, age 17, presumed died 1886, was barely legible from water damage. But at the bottom, the same closing phrase was still visible, etched deep into the paper as though pressed with a trembling hand. "If I fail to wake, let this be my offering." Every book ended the same way. Some held dried flowers inside, pressed between pages, flattened until only shadow remained. One contained a lock of hair braided into a thin circle and sewn directly into the binding. Another had been pierced through with a single pearl-headed pin, rusted through the paper, the tip buried in the back cover like a hidden needle. None of the books had dates. None were ever signed in full. But archivists later confirmed that the initials matched the lost daughters named in the chapel's hidden ledger. 13 in total, each book aligning with a girl whose name had vanished from public record before she could legally wed. And the most chilling detail: every book contained a blank page at the end, clean, uncreased, untouched, as if something had been left unfinished, or as if the ritual didn't allow for a final line. Margaret Felton had written nothing about these books in her own journals, but a note was later found pressed between two loose attic floorboards. It was written in an older hand, presumed to be Evangeline's, and it read simply, "The voice must promise before it is taken. It is not sacrifice unless it's chosen." But the question remained, how much choice does a girl have when silence is wrapped in lace and obedience is sewn into paper before her lips can part? The books are now sealed in a glass case at the local historical society. Visitors rarely linger long. Many report a strange stillness in the room, as if breath becomes harder to keep, and each spine remains bare, each promise unread aloud, each vow a whisper buried in pages that no one was meant to hold, because these were not meant for celebration. They were confessions written in advance, and none of them were ever spoken. It was never marked on the blueprints, not in the 1840 drafts, not in the 1901 editions, not in the 1937 preservation reports. For over a century, the chapel at Wicklow Glen had been picked apart by historians, genealogists, and scandal-hungry writers, but no one had thought to look beneath the altar itself. It wasn't until a partial floor collapse during a structural inspection in 1972 that the marble cracked just enough to reveal the void below. A space no wider than a room, no taller than a coffin stood upright, and not mentioned in a single known record. When they pulled the altar back and removed the broken slab, a drop of nearly 5 feet opened into a cavity chiseled smooth, the walls made of the same white-veined stone as the breathless chamber beneath the estate. But this was no root cellar. This was colder, sharper, designed. The ceiling sloped downward toward the center of the room, where a pipe, the very same voice pipe that descended from the chapel's pulpit, emerged into the marble like a throat from above. Around it, the walls were curved in subtle acoustics, the smooth stone amplifying even the quietest breath. When a voice was tested from the surface, it echoed down and struck the chamber in full resonance. A whisper above came through below like a command, and when a voice was sent from within the chamber upward, it rang through the copper mesh beneath the pipe organ, thin, faint, but unmistakable. That explained why the Reverend in 1913 had reported phantom harmonics from the organ pipes on the morning of Clara's death. He said the instrument had shuddered before the doors opened, that no one had touched a key, that it had sounded not like music but like someone breathing beneath the floorboards. The floor of the chamber held more secrets. Beneath a layer of white dust and crumbling salt deposits, copper piping had been inlaid into the stone in the precise shape of a human mouth, open, oval, and wide. Each lip line had been riveted down with hand-forged pins. From above, it was barely visible. But from within, it took up nearly the entire floor, a metal mouth waiting beneath the altar of a chapel that had married no daughters, only buried them. The symbolism wasn't lost on those who discovered it. This was no utility system, no heating duct. The piping wasn't hollow, it led nowhere. It was closed at both ends, it had no function but form, no purpose but presence. A mouth that did not speak. A silence cast in copper. Along the walls they found evidence of use, faint finger grooves along the pipe shaft as if hands had gripped the base in desperation. Scratches in the marble where skin had tried to hold on. A single glove, white, small, stained with something blackened by time, was wedged into a corner behind the drain slot. It matched the style worn by the Felton daughters in every known photograph. And then there was the soot, not enough to suggest fire, but enough to suggest something had been burned. A ritual object, perhaps a vow, perhaps a body. No one could determine exactly how many voices had passed through that space, but tests revealed that the copper mouth had once carried heat, perhaps steam sent from the main house or a nearby furnace. This meant that the chamber was not just heard but felt. Whoever stood in the chapel above playing hymns, delivering sermons, or saying prayers over the daughters' still forms would have unknowingly stood on a mouth that whispered warmth through the soles of their feet. A breath from the dead, traveling upward, mistaken for sacred resonance. Margaret Felton had never spoken of the space, nor had Evangeline. The altar was never moved, never cleaned beneath. The area was sacred, they'd said, not to be disturbed. But what they had built was not sacred. It was a mirror, not of light but of silence. Of every girl who had whispered her last words into stone and copper, her voice pulled upward and passed off as grace. The chamber was resealed in the 1980s, marked as structurally unsafe. No memorial, no sign. But those who'd stood within say they remember how sound behaved strangely, how their own voices returned to them slightly warped, like someone else had said the words back in their tone. And when they asked what the mouth had spoken all those years, no one answered. Because whatever it had said it through them. For nearly a century, the story of Clara Felton ended at the altar. Pale skin, lifeless body, bare ring finger beneath her mother's portrait. But long after the estate crumbled and the chapel was shuttered for good, a letter surfaced, pressed between the floorboards of the northeast wing, hidden beneath a rusted nail and sealed in wax that bore the original Felton crest. Its contents rewrote everything. It was dated October 17, 1913, the night before her wedding. The script was shaky at first, then firm. She addressed it not to her fiancé, not to her mother, but to whoever dares to name the truth. And within its pages, Clara confessed what no one had dared to imagine. She hadn't died. She had hidden. Clara had begun preparing months before the ritual. She had read the doctrine in secret. She had pressed her hands against the attic floor until she found the hollow. She had listened at the chapel's base for the sounds that weren't part of worship. The pipe that echoed in both directions. The lock that clicked from outside. The footsteps that never entered but always waited. She knew her mother would prepare the tonic, bitter and filled with the same powdered glass that had taken her cousin Susanna. But Clara never drank it. She mimicked the ritual, let the smell linger on her lips, and used pig's blood in the basin to simulate the final purge. When her mother left the chapel for the night, Clara waited. Waited for the stillness that always came after control. Then she opened the hidden panel behind the altar. She crawled into the marble cavity where others had whispered their last. She pressed herself beneath the floorboards of the old cellar chamber, surrounded by stone and salt, holding her breath until the sounds above passed. Her body cooled there, beneath the root wall, her limbs numb but intact. She lay beside the copper mouth, heard her name spoken in the chapel, and did not move. She had stolen the ring before the ceremony, wrapped it in cloth, hidden it within a hollowed hymnal in the organ pit. She left the body blank, lifeless. She let them believe it. She knew they would. But most chillingly, Clara confessed something more. She hadn't just escaped the ritual, she had performed her own. She had locked the chapel door from the inside before crawling beneath. She had drawn the symbols in reverse. She had inverted every step, faking stillness, mimicking purity, simulating death, until the ritual itself collapsed. And she left the family with what they understood best. A silent daughter laid out beneath a portrait, breathless, untouched, seemingly willing. But it was all a lie. She vanished that night. No records followed. Some say she fled to Maine. Others believe she joined a cloister under an assumed name. A few believe she returned once, decades later, to retrieve the dress, but found it already sealed in salt and mildew. Whatever the truth, her body was never found because she had never offered it. Only the illusion of it. The letter ended with a single line, written without flourish, without plea. I was never clean. I was never still. And that is how I survived. Clara had turned the doctrine against itself. She had made stillness into camouflage, silence into resistance. She had fooled the very system designed to erase her. She had become the only daughter who lived by pretending to die. And she locked the door herself. By the time Clara's letter came to light, the Felton estate had long since fallen into disrepair. Ivy choked the windows, floorboards curled, the chapel roof sagged under its own weight, and the altar, once polished to shine like bone, was stained dark from years of forgotten rain. But the letter changed everything. Not with noise, not with scandal, but with the soft, undeniable weight of truth. For the first time, someone had written it down. The rituals were real. The deaths were deliberate. The silence was planned. A quiet investigation followed. Quiet because the family's influence still lingered like smoke over old wood. Quiet because there were no bodies to exhume, only sealed records, hollowed books, blood-washed gowns, and one name that refused to disappear. Clara, the girl who had played dead to live. There were no arrests. The last of the Feltons had either vanished or died under aliases. Margaret's final property deed was unsigned. No charges were filed. But within the quiet, a reckoning began. Historians traced connections between the Felton doctrine and broader practices of the time. Private sanitariums that enforced female virtue programs, secret fasting chambers hidden inside rural convents, bridal conditioning facilities disguised as finishing schools. What had once been whispered as old customs was now recognized for what it truly was: institutional harm wrapped in maternal language. In 1915, 2 years after Clara's escape, Massachusetts passed a bill barring all private religious or domestic institutions from conducting prenuptial female isolation or sanctification treatments. The law never mentioned the Feltons by name. It didn't have to. Everyone knew. Over time, the estate was picked apart by preservationists. Some pieces were sold: marble tiles, brass hooks, oil portraits stripped of frames. But one item remained untouched: the gown. It sat alone in the cedar chest, yellowed and heavy, pressed between lavender sachets that had long since dried into powder. 13 girls had been placed in it. 13 names matched the books, the doctrine, the stains. But no one ever came to claim it. No museum would display it. No relative stepped forward to preserve it. So the gown was sealed in a private vault inside a climate-controlled drawer labeled unworn textile. See 1860s, 1910s. But it had been worn too many times, only never by a bride who walked out of the chapel. In 1987, a small memorial was erected at the edge of Wicklow Glen, paid for by a historian who had spent his life documenting unsanctioned premarital rites across New England. It's not large, just a stone bench beneath a tree facing the hill where the chapel once stood. 13 names are carved into the backrest, no dates. No last words, just names. And beneath them a single line: may your silence be broken by truth. Locals say the air feels colder near the stone, even in July. That birds don't land on the branches above. That once, on a foggy morning, a girl was seen standing beside the bench in white. But when someone called out, she was gone. No one speaks the Felton name aloud anymore in Wicklow Glen. But those who know, remember. And those who remember do not let the stillness settle too long. Because the truth is, evil rarely comes dressed in red. It comes in white. Pressed, folded, stitched by a mother's hand, hung in a room that no one cleans. Passed down like a tradition that no one questions. And sometimes the most horrifying things are not the ones that scream. They're the ones that wait quietly in the cedar chest never claimed.